The most dangerous moment in a marriage isn't the night someone cheats. It's the moment they finally stop caring. At 2:58 a.m., the neon glow of downtown Chicago still painted the wet pavement outside the Lexington Hotel as Daniel Carter stepped through the revolving door with the loose confidence of a man who believed his life was perfectly under control. The air smelled faintly of rain and late-night traffic, taxis gliding past like slow yellow shadows while the city hummed with the restless energy that never quite slept. Daniel checked his watch, a sleek steel piece that caught the streetlight for a second before he slid his hands into his coat pockets, already rehearsing the casual explanation he'd give when he got home. Something simple, something believable, something Emily would accept the way she always did. In his mind, the scene was predictable. The quiet two-story townhouse on Maple Street, the soft kitchen light glowing above the marble counter, maybe the faint scent of coffee drifting through the air even before sunrise because Emily had a habit of waking early on Saturdays. He pictured her moving quietly through the house in one of those pale sweaters she liked, the ones that made the place feel calm and steady, like nothing in the world could ever really fall apart there. That certainty had become a kind of background noise in Daniel's life. The same way you stop noticing the ticking of a clock after you've lived with it long enough. Emily was dependable, patient, forgiving, qualities he had slowly begun to treat not as gifts, but as guarantees. The drive home took 12 minutes. The streets nearly empty except for a delivery truck rumbling past a closed diner and the occasional traffic light blinking red against the misty air. Daniel pulled into the driveway just after 3:10 a.m., the headlights washing briefly across the front windows before he shut off the engine and stepped out into the cool silence of the neighborhood. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had. The trimmed hedges, the porch light Emily insisted on leaving on, the quiet suburban street stretching out under rows of maple trees. He unlocked the front door without thinking, pushing it open with the same relaxed confidence he carried everywhere else in his life. But the moment he stepped inside, something felt wrong. Not dramatic, not obvious, just wrong in the quietest possible way. The house was still, but not the familiar kind of stillness that meant someone was sleeping upstairs. This silence felt hollow, like the air itself had shifted. The kitchen light was on, casting a soft glow across the marble island, and for a second Daniel almost smiled, expecting to see Emily there like always. Instead, the room was empty. No coffee machine humming. No quiet footsteps upstairs. Just a single small object resting in the center of the counter, catching the light in a way that made Daniel stop mid-step before he even realized why. It was a ring. His wedding ring. And beside it, a folded note. Daniel stared at the ring for several seconds before his mind caught up with what his eyes were seeing. The small band of gold reflecting the warm kitchen light in a way that made the entire room feel strangely unfamiliar, as if he had walked into someone else's house by mistake. Slowly he stepped closer to the marble counter, the quiet of the townhouse pressing against his ears. The folded note beside the ring was simple white paper, the kind Emily always kept in the kitchen drawer for grocery lists and reminders. Daniel picked it up with the casual irritation of a man who believed he was about to deal with a minor argument. Nothing more than one of those emotional reactions Emily sometimes had when she felt ignored. He unfolded the paper. The message was short, for words written in Emily's careful handwriting. "You finally set me free." Daniel let out a quiet laugh under his breath, shaking his head as if the whole thing were a mild inconvenience. "Drama," he muttered to himself, placing the note back on the counter. Emily had always had a tendency toward dramatic gestures when she was hurt. A quiet weekend away with her sister, a long walk alone by the lake, an evening of silence that usually ended with forgiveness and a calm conversation the next morning. That was the pattern. That was the life he had grown used to. But as Daniel glanced around the kitchen again, something about the stillness began to press harder against his confidence. The air felt different. Not angry, not tense, just empty. He walked toward the living room, expecting to see Emily's laptop on the side table where she usually worked in the evenings. The table was clear. The small reading lamp was gone too. Daniel frowned slightly, the first real crease of confusion appearing on his forehead. He walked upstairs, his footsteps echoing softly along the hallway. The bedroom door was open. The bed was neatly made, the pale gray comforter smoothed perfectly flat, but the closet door stood wide open. Half the hangers were empty. Daniel stepped closer, pushing the closet door further back as if that would somehow change what he was seeing. Emily's coats were gone. The long navy one she wore every winter, the light beige one she liked in the fall, the soft cardigan she wore around the house on quiet mornings. All missing. He turned toward the dresser. The jewelry tray was empty except for a pair of earrings she rarely wore. Her suitcase was gone from the corner of the room. Daniel stood there in the middle of the bedroom, the silence now louder than any argument could have been. He pulled his phone from his pocket and opened Emily's contact. The call rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. He tried again. The same result. Daniel exhaled slowly, telling himself that she probably just needed space, that she had gone to stay with a friend, that this would all settle down once she cooled off. But as he walked back downstairs, his eyes landed once more on the empty marble counter, the ring, the note, and the quiet house that suddenly felt much larger than it had only 20 minutes earlier, and for the first time a small, unfamiliar thought slipped quietly into his mind. What if she was not planning to come back at all? Morning arrived slowly over Maple Street, pale sunlight stretching through the quiet windows of the townhouse as Daniel Carter sat alone at the kitchen counter where the ring and the note had not moved an inch since the moment he found them hours earlier. The clock on the wall ticked toward 8 o'clock, the same hour Emily usually poured coffee into 2 white mugs and opened the curtains to let the light fill the room. Daniel had never noticed how quiet the house could be at this time of day. Usually there was the faint sound of running water upstairs, the soft hum of the coffee maker, the gentle rhythm of Emily moving through the house as if she were the calm center of it all. Now there was nothing but still air and the distant sound of a car passing on the street outside. Daniel rubbed his eyes and stood up, walking back toward the living room with slow, uncertain steps. The absence of Emily was beginning to show itself in ways he had never paid attention to before. The framed photographs along the hallway wall were gone, leaving faint rectangles of lighter paint behind. The small ceramic bowl Emily kept by the door for keys had disappeared. Even the blanket that used to rest over the arm of the couch had vanished, leaving the room looking strangely staged, as if someone had quietly removed all the warmth while he was not paying attention. Daniel pulled out his phone again and tried calling Emily one more time. The line rang twice before the same voicemail greeting answered in her calm voice, the sound of it echoing in the empty room like a reminder of a life that had already moved forward without him. He ended the call and opened his messages, scrolling through weeks of conversations he had barely read before. There were small things he had overlooked. Emily asking if they could talk after dinner. Emily mentioning a gallery opening she had been invited to. Emily suggesting they take a weekend trip to Lake Geneva the way they used to. Each message had seemed minor at the time, easy to postpone, easy to ignore. Now those quiet invitations felt like doors he had left closed one after another without ever noticing she had stopped knocking. Daniel set the phone down and looked once more toward the kitchen counter where the gold ring caught the morning light. For the first time the idea settled fully into his mind that Emily had not left in anger or desperation. She had left with intention. The house around him was proof of that. Nothing was broken. Nothing was chaotic. She had simply taken the pieces of her life that mattered and walked away from everything that did not. Daniel stood there in the stillness of the room, listening to the ticking clock and the distant sounds of the neighborhood waking up, and a realization slowly pressed into his chest with a weight he could not ignore. Emily had not been the woman who could never leave. She had been the woman who had already decided to. And he had been the last person to understand it. By late afternoon the townhouse felt less like a home and more like a museum of a life that had quietly ended. Daniel Carter had not left the house all day. The sunlight had moved slowly across the hardwood floor, climbing the wall of the living room and fading again as the hours passed, while the silence inside the house remained unchanged. He stood near the window now, staring out at Maple Street where neighbors moved through ordinary routines that suddenly felt distant from his own world. A woman walked her golden retriever past the sidewalk. A delivery truck stopped 2 houses down. Life outside continued with calm predictability, but inside the Carter house everything had shifted in a way Daniel could no longer dismiss as temporary. Around 3 o'clock his phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, the sudden sound sharp against the still air. Daniel walked over quickly, expecting Emily's name to appear on the screen. Instead, the caller ID displayed the name of his bank. For a moment he considered ignoring it, but something about the timing made him answer. The representative spoke in a polite professional voice, confirming a routine notification regarding recent changes to a joint account. Daniel frowned slightly, leaning against the marble counter as he listened. According to the bank records, Emily had visited the branch 2 days earlier to close the shared savings account and transfer her portion into a separate account under her name. The process had been completed legally with proper documentation, and the representative simply wanted to confirm that Daniel was aware of the change. Daniel responded automatically, saying yes, thank you, before ending the call with a slow movement of his thumb. He stood there for a long moment after the line went quiet. 2 days earlier. That meant Emily had walked into a bank branch, signed the paperwork, and finalized the separation of their finances while he had still been living his life as if nothing were different. He glanced again at the ring on the counter, and then toward the hallway where the empty spaces on the wall marked where photographs once hung. Another realization followed quietly behind the first. Emily had not left suddenly in the middle of the night. She had been preparing for this. Carefully, quietly, methodically. Daniel moved toward the dining room where a small wooden cabinet held household documents. He opened the drawer and searched through the folders until he found the envelope containing their property paperwork. The townhouse deed was still there, but the folder that once contained Emily's freelance design contracts was gone. Even her small notebook where she used to track business ideas had disappeared. Daniel sat down slowly in one of the dining chairs, the late afternoon light stretching across the table while a calm but heavy understanding settled deeper into his thoughts. Emily had not been trapped in this marriage the way he had assumed. She had been building her own path quietly in the background while he believed she would always remain where she was. Outside the window, the sky had begun to soften into the warm colors of early evening. The same hour Emily often spent sketching ideas for her design projects or reading on the back patio with a cup of tea. Daniel leaned back in the chair and looked around the quiet room one more time, finally understanding something that had never occurred to him before. The woman he thought would never leave had not been waiting for permission. She had simply been waiting for the moment when leaving made sense. The evening settled over Maple Street with the quiet calm of a neighborhood that had no idea a marriage had just ended inside one of its tidy brick townhouses. Daniel Carter stood in the kitchen again, the same place where everything had begun to unravel only hours earlier, and for the first time he realized how much of the house had always belonged to Emily's presence rather than the walls themselves. The kitchen used to carry the faint scent of roasted coffee beans and lemon soap, the kind of simple details he had never noticed until they disappeared. Now the air smelled neutral, almost sterile, like a hotel room waiting for the next guest. Daniel ran a hand across the smooth marble countertop and looked again at the gold ring resting beside the folded note. He had not moved either object all day, as if touching them would somehow confirm that what was happening was real. Outside, the last light of the sun dipped behind the row of maple trees, casting long shadows across the street. A neighbor's porch light clicked on. Somewhere down the block, a lawn sprinkler began its quiet ticking rhythm. Normal sounds. Ordinary sounds. Yet inside the Carter house the silence continued to expand, filling every corner that Emily's voice used to reach. Daniel walked slowly through the living room, noticing details he had overlooked for years. The bookshelf looked strangely incomplete without the small sketchbooks Emily used to keep stacked along the side. The reading chair by the window no longer held the soft blanket she liked to wrap around her shoulders during cold Chicago evenings. Even the houseplants near the patio door were gone, leaving faint rings on the wooden floor where the pots once stood. Daniel paused beside the empty space and felt a subtle shift in his memory. Emily had asked him once, months ago, if they could repaint the living room a warmer color. He had barely looked up from his laptop when he answered that the current color was fine. Another memory surfaced right after that one. Emily suggesting they take a weekend trip out to Lake Geneva, just the two of them, the way they used to when the marriage was new and the future still felt wide open. He had told her work was too busy. Always later. Always next month. Daniel walked toward the back door and looked out into the small patio where Emily used to sit in the evenings with her tea and a notebook filled with design sketches. The patio chair was gone now. The small table was gone too. The space looked empty in a way that felt intentional rather than rushed. Emily had not fled from this house. She had quietly removed herself from it piece by piece until nothing of her remained. Daniel returned to the kitchen and leaned both hands on the counter, staring once more at the ring in the fading light. The realization that had been slowly forming all day finally settled into something undeniable. Emily had not left because of a single night. She had left because of every small moment that came before it. Every time he dismissed her voice. Every time he assumed she would stay no matter what he did. The night he chose to spend elsewhere had simply been the final confirmation she needed. Daniel stood there as darkness filled the house and understood something that felt both simple and impossible to change. The woman he thought would always be waiting had already built a life beyond the door, and he had not even noticed when she started walking toward it. The night grew deeper around the quiet townhouse, and Daniel Carter remained standing in the kitchen long after the street outside had gone dark. The soft glow of the overhead light reflected off the marble counter and the untouched wedding ring, casting a faint circle of gold onto the stone surface. Hours earlier he had believed this moment would pass, that Emily would eventually return with the same calm forgiveness she had always offered before. But the longer he stood in the silence of the house, the more that belief began to dissolve. Around 10 o'clock, Daniel finally moved, walking slowly toward the staircase with a strange sense that he was exploring a place he thought he knew but had never truly seen. The upstairs hallway was dim except for the light spilling from the bedroom doorway. The room looked orderly, almost staged, the way a real estate agent might prepare a house for sale. The bed was still perfectly made. The pale gray comforter remained smooth and untouched. But the small details Emily had once filled the room with were gone. The framed photograph from their anniversary trip to Colorado was missing from the dresser. The small candle Emily used to light in the evenings had disappeared. Even the faint scent of lavender she liked to keep in the room had faded into the neutral smell of empty space. Daniel stepped toward the closet again, this time noticing something he had overlooked before. A single hanger remained in the center of the rack. Hanging from it was one of Emily's older jackets, a light denim piece she rarely wore anymore. Daniel reached out and touched the sleeve, feeling the soft worn fabric between his fingers. For a moment a memory surfaced without warning. Emily standing in the kitchen months earlier wearing that same jacket while she talked excitedly about a new interior design client she had met at a local art market. Daniel had nodded politely at the time without really listening, his attention half focused on emails on his phone. He remembered answering with a distracted comment about how busy work had been lately. Emily had smiled softly and changed the subject. At the time the moment had seemed completely ordinary. Now it felt different. Daniel realized with a quiet shock that he could not remember the last full conversation they had shared where he had truly listened to what she was saying. He lowered the jacket back onto the hanger and stepped away from the closet. The room felt larger than it should have, as if Emily's absence had stretched the walls themselves. Downstairs the clock in the kitchen chimed 11 times, the sound echoing faintly through the quiet house. Daniel walked back down the stairs and stopped again at the kitchen counter where the ring still waited beneath the light. He picked it up for the first time that day, turning the gold band slowly between his fingers. The weight of it felt strangely unfamiliar. For years he had worn it without thinking, the same way he had lived inside the marriage without questioning the quiet stability Emily had always provided. But standing there now, Daniel understood something that had never crossed his mind before. Emily had not needed to argue, shout, or demand anything from him. She had simply reached a moment where staying no longer made sense. And when that moment arrived, she had walked away with a calm certainty that left no space for negotiation. Daniel placed the ring back onto the marble counter and looked around the silent kitchen one more time. The house that had once felt like the center of his life now felt like a place he had been left behind in. A quiet reminder that the woman he thought would always remain by his side had already stepped into a future where he no longer existed. Morning returned to Maple Street with a pale gray sky stretching over the quiet Chicago neighborhood. And for the first time in years Daniel Carter woke up in a house that did not feel like his own. He had fallen asleep sometime after midnight on the living room couch, the faint glow of the kitchen light still spilling across the floor when he opened his eyes. For a moment he remained still, disoriented by the unfamiliar silence surrounding him. Usually mornings in the Carter house carried a gentle rhythm. Emily moving quietly in the kitchen, the soft click of mugs on the counter, the smell of coffee drifting through the hallway. But when Daniel sat up and looked toward the kitchen, the same empty counter waited under. The light, the gold ring resting exactly where he had left it. The quiet was not temporary. It had settled into the house like a permanent resident. Daniel stood slowly and walked into the kitchen, his movements heavy with the realization that this day would begin exactly the way the last one had ended. Alone. Outside the window, the street was already beginning its normal routine. A school bus rolled past the corner. A man jogged down the sidewalk with headphones in his ears. Somewhere nearby, a garage door lifted with a mechanical hum. Daniel poured himself a glass of water from the sink and leaned against the counter, staring at the backyard patio where the chair Emily used to sit in every evening had once been. It had always been easy to assume she would still be there tomorrow. That assumption had quietly shaped the way he moved through their marriage. He had believed Emily's patience was endless, that her calm nature meant she would always adjust, always forgive, always stay. Now the absence of her presence made that belief feel almost naive. Daniel looked down at his phone again and opened his messages, scrolling further back through months of conversations he had barely read at the time. One message from Emily caught his attention. It had been sent nearly 6 weeks earlier. Daniel, I signed the lease for a studio space today. I think this might really work. I would love to show you when you have time. Daniel stared at the message, trying to remember what he had said in response. The conversation thread revealed the answer immediately. Sounds good. Busy today. Talk later. There had never been a later. Daniel set the phone down slowly and felt a quiet wave of understanding pass through him. Emily had not been waiting for him to notice her life. She had simply begun building it anyway. He walked toward the back door and stepped outside onto the patio. The cool morning air carried the scent of damp grass and distant traffic. The patio looked larger now without the small table and chair Emily used to keep there, the space open in a way that felt strangely final. Daniel stood there for several minutes, looking at the empty corner where Emily used to sit sketching ideas in the early evening light. A thought surfaced quietly in his mind, one he could no longer ignore. Emily had not disappeared from his life overnight. She had been slowly stepping away for months while he continued living as if nothing had changed. And now, standing in the quiet backyard with the morning sun beginning to climb over the rooftops, Daniel finally understood something that arrived far too late. The moment he started paying attention was the moment she had already stopped waiting. The morning continued quietly over Maple Street, but inside the Carter townhouse the silence had begun to feel heavier, as if every room carried the echo of something Daniel Carter had failed to notice when it still mattered. After standing on the empty patio for several minutes, he stepped back inside and closed the glass door behind him, the soft click sounding unusually loud in the quiet house. The kitchen still looked exactly as it had the night before, the pale sunlight stretching across the marble counter where the gold ring rested beside Emily's short note. Daniel paused there again, staring at the simple words written in her calm handwriting. You finally set me free. At first the sentence had sounded dramatic to him, almost theatrical, the kind of emotional reaction he believed would fade after a few days. But now the words felt different. They sounded less like anger and more like relief. Daniel picked up the note and read it again slowly, noticing how steady the ink lines looked, how carefully Emily had written each letter. There had been no rush, no trembling frustration. She had written that message with the quiet certainty of someone who had already made peace with the decision. Daniel set the note down again and walked toward the living room, his gaze drifting across the empty spaces where small pieces of Emily's life used to exist. The absence of those details was beginning to reveal something uncomfortable about the past few years. Emily had never demanded attention in obvious ways. She had not raised her voice or created dramatic confrontations. Instead, she had offered small invitations, moments where she tried to bring Daniel back into the life they once shared. A dinner reservation she suggested weeks in advance. A gallery show she hoped he might attend. A simple walk along Lake Michigan on a Sunday afternoon. Each time Daniel had answered with the same quiet confidence that there would always be another chance later. Later had been the most convenient word in his vocabulary. Later when work slowed down. Later when the next project finished. Later when things were less busy. Standing in the still living room now, Daniel understood that later had slowly become never. He moved toward the front window and looked out at the street again. The morning traffic had grown steadier, neighbors beginning their daily routines without noticing the quiet transformation that had taken place inside his home. A woman across the street stepped into her car with a travel mug in her hand. Two children rode bicycles down the sidewalk toward the park at the end of the block. Everything looked ordinary, but Daniel felt as if he had stepped slightly outside the rhythm of that normal life. The past 24 hours had shown him something he had never considered before. Emily had not been standing still while he moved forward with his own ambitions. She had been quietly building a direction of her own, one that no longer required him to be part of it. Daniel turned away from the window and walked slowly back toward the kitchen counter where the ring waited in the sunlight. He picked it up again, feeling the cool weight of the gold in his palm. For years he had believed the ring symbolized stability, something permanent that could not easily disappear. But now it felt like a reminder of something he had misunderstood completely. Marriage had not been something Emily needed in order to feel whole. It had simply been a chapter she was willing to close once she realized she was the only one still trying to write it. Daniel placed the ring back onto the marble counter and stood there quietly, finally accepting a truth that had taken far too long to reach him. Emily had not vanished. She had simply continued moving forward while he remained standing in the same place, assuming she would always be there when he decided to look. The late morning light had grown brighter over Maple Street, but inside the Carter townhouse time seemed to move more slowly, stretching each quiet moment into something Daniel Carter could not escape. After standing by the kitchen counter for several minutes, he finally picked up his phone again, the small device suddenly feeling heavier than usual in his hand. The screen still showed Emily's contact at the top of his call history, the last number he had dialed the night before when he still believed the situation was temporary. Daniel hesitated before pressing the call button again, knowing the result would likely be the same. The line rang once, then twice, before Emily's calm recorded greeting answered in the same steady voice he had heard so many times before. "Hello, this is Emily. Please leave a message and I will return your call when I can." The message ended with a soft beep that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Daniel remained silent for a moment, then ended the call without leaving a message. He placed the phone back on the counter and looked around the kitchen again, the quiet space reflecting a truth he could no longer ignore. Emily had not left the door open behind her. She had closed it carefully. Daniel walked slowly through the house once more, noticing how every room now carried the same careful emptiness. In the hallway, the small wooden table where Emily once placed fresh flowers every week was gone. In the guest room, the soft blue throw blanket she used when her sister visited had disappeared. Even the small collection of cookbooks Emily kept near the kitchen window had vanished from the shelf, leaving only a faint rectangle of dust where they once stood. Daniel stopped in front of the empty shelf and felt another quiet realization settle into place. Emily had not taken random belongings. She had taken the parts of the house that belonged to her life, the things that represented her plans, her interests, her identity beyond the marriage. Everything she left behind had been something they once shared, but the pieces that belonged to her alone were gone. Daniel leaned against the wall and closed his eyes for a moment, memories beginning to surface with uncomfortable clarity. Emily standing in the kitchen months ago, talking about expanding her interior design work beyond local clients. Emily suggesting they convert the spare bedroom into a studio where she could meet people and show them her ideas. At the time, Daniel had treated those conversations like small hobbies, temporary interests that would eventually fade. He had never asked how serious she was about those plans. Now it was clear that Emily had been building something real, while he continued believing their life would remain exactly the same. Daniel opened his eyes and walked back toward the living room window, the late morning sun now bright across the quiet street. For the first time, he wondered where Emily was at that exact moment. Not in anger, not in panic, but with a strange sense of curiosity. Was she sitting in a small apartment somewhere across the city, sketching new ideas the way she used to on the patio? Was she meeting a client in a bright studio space she had mentioned weeks earlier? The truth was he did not know, and that realization carried a deeper meaning than the empty house around him. For years, Daniel had believed he understood Emily completely, that her quiet loyalty meant her world revolved around the life they built together. But standing in the silent house that morning, he finally understood something he should have recognized long ago. Emily had always been moving forward. He had simply mistaken her patience for permanence. The afternoon light drifted slowly across the quiet rooms of the Carter townhouse, stretching long pale lines across the hardwood floor as Daniel Carter remained standing by the living room window. Hours had passed since the morning began, yet the house still felt suspended in a strange pause, as if time inside its walls had not fully caught up with the rest of the world outside. Cars continued to pass along Maple Street. A delivery van stopped briefly at the corner. Somewhere nearby, a lawn mower hummed to life. The ordinary rhythm of the neighborhood continued without interruption, but Daniel felt separated from it in a way he had never experienced before. He turned away from the window and walked slowly back toward the kitchen where the ring and the folded note still rested under the quiet glow of the ceiling light. The sight of them no longer felt shocking. Instead, it carried a steady weight of understanding that had grown clearer with every passing hour. Emily had not disappeared in anger or desperation. She had simply finished waiting. Daniel leaned both hands against the marble counter and looked down at the short message again. "You finally set me free." Earlier those words had sounded dramatic. Now they felt almost calm. The sentence did not accuse him. It did not demand anything. It simply described a moment Emily had already accepted. Daniel glanced around the kitchen once more and noticed another detail that had escaped him the night before. The small white calendar Emily used to keep on the refrigerator door was gone. She had always written quiet reminders there in neat handwriting. Client meetings, design ideas, coffee with friends. At the time, Daniel had rarely looked at those notes closely. His own schedule had always lived inside the glowing screen of his phone. But the absence of that calendar now revealed something else. Emily had not just removed her belongings from the house. She had removed the structure of her days from the life they once shared. Daniel opened the refrigerator door without thinking and stared inside. The shelves held only a few basic items. A carton of milk, a jar of mustard, a bottle of sparkling water. The meals Emily used to prepare during the week were gone. The small containers she organized so carefully had disappeared along with the rest of her routine. He closed the refrigerator again and rested his hand against the cool metal surface, feeling a quiet memory return. Emily standing in this same kitchen one evening months ago, explaining how she wanted to take on larger design projects, maybe even collaborate with a small architecture firm in the city. Daniel had listened for only a moment before telling her that Chicago was already full of designers competing for attention. At the time, he believed he was offering practical advice. Now he wondered if that had been the moment Emily realized she would have to build her future without expecting him to understand it. Daniel stepped back from the refrigerator and walked slowly toward the front hallway. The empty spaces along the wall where photographs once hung felt like silent markers of time he could not return to. Each missing frame represented a memory Emily had chosen to take with her rather than leave behind. He paused there for a long moment, looking at the pale outlines where the pictures used to be, and finally accepted something that had been unfolding quietly since the moment he opened the front door the night before. Emily had not left a sudden gap in his life. She had revealed one that had been there for far longer than he realized. The late afternoon shadows stretched across the quiet hallway of the Carter townhouse, as Daniel Carter stood staring at the pale outlines on the wall where photographs once hung. The empty shapes seemed to tell their own story, each one marking a moment Emily had chosen to carry with her rather than leave behind. Daniel slowly reached out and touched the wall where their favorite picture used to be, the one from their trip to Colorado 5 years earlier. In that photograph, they had been standing on a mountain overlook, the wind catching Emily's hair while she laughed at something he had said. At the time, he remembered thinking how steady everything in his life felt, how certain he was that the future would look almost exactly like that moment. Standing there now, Daniel realized that certainty had never been shared equally. Emily had been smiling in that photograph, but she had also been the one holding the camera for most of the trip, documenting the journey, while Daniel simply enjoyed the view. He lowered his hand from the wall and walked slowly back toward the living room, the quiet of the house following him like a shadow. The afternoon sunlight had begun to soften, turning the windows into pale mirrors that reflected the empty room back at him. For years he had moved through this space without noticing how much of its warmth had come from Emily's small routines. The books she read on quiet evenings, the music she sometimes played while sketching ideas at the dining table, the way she opened the windows during spring mornings so the house filled with fresh air from the lake. Those details had always seemed like background to the larger structure of their life. Now Daniel understood they had been the structure all along. He walked into the kitchen again and sat down at the dining table. The chair across from him still pushed neatly under the wood surface the way Emily used to leave it after breakfast. His phone lay on the table beside him, the screen dark except for the faint reflection of the ceiling light. For the first time all day Daniel considered sending Emily a message rather than calling. He unlocked the phone and opened their conversation thread, the last message he had sent sitting there from the night before. "Are you home?" It looked strangely small on the screen now, a question that belonged to a moment when he still believed the house was only temporarily empty. Daniel stared at the blinking cursor for a long time before typing a new message. "I did not realize how far you had already gone." He read the sentence twice, then erased it slowly. Another message formed in his mind, something about wanting to talk or asking where she was, but the words felt inadequate the moment he imagined them appearing on her phone. Daniel set the device down again and leaned back in his chair, looking across the quiet room where the fading light stretched across the floorboards. The truth had become impossible to avoid. This was not a misunderstanding waiting to be explained. Emily had already explained everything in the most direct way possible. She had left. Daniel remained seated there as evening approached, the quiet house settling around him with the calm certainty of something that would not change overnight. For the first time he understood that the life he thought had been paused was already continuing somewhere else without him. Evening settled slowly over Maple Street again, the same quiet rhythm returning to the neighborhood, while the Carter townhouse remained suspended in its strange stillness. Daniel Carter was still sitting at the dining table where he had been for nearly an hour, his phone resting dark beside his hand, while the fading light outside the window turned the sky a soft shade of amber. Across from him the empty chair remained pushed neatly beneath the table, the place where Emily used to sit during quiet dinners when the two of them spoke about ordinary things like work schedules, new restaurants in the city, or plans they believed would shape the future together. Daniel found himself staring at that chair longer than he expected, noticing how natural it looked for it to remain empty. The realization carried a strange clarity that had been forming slowly since the moment he walked through the door the night before. The house was not waiting for Emily to return. It had already adjusted to her absence. Daniel stood from the table and walked toward the kitchen counter again, where the gold ring still rested beside the folded note. The small band reflected the soft kitchen light the same way it had the night before, but now the image looked less like a symbol and more like a quiet artifact from a chapter that had already ended. Daniel picked up the ring once more and held it in his palm, remembering the afternoon he had placed it on Emily's finger years earlier. At the time he believed the gesture represented something permanent, a promise that both of them would remain in the same place no matter how their lives changed. But standing alone in the silent kitchen now, Daniel understood how incomplete that belief had been. A promise only carried meaning if both people continued choosing it every day. Emily had chosen it for years. He had simply assumed it would always exist without effort. Daniel turned the ring slowly between his fingers, the smooth gold catching the last of the evening light through the window. Somewhere outside a car door closed. The distant hum of traffic drifted from the main street beyond the neighborhood. Life continued moving forward with quiet certainty. Inside the kitchen Daniel felt something shift in the way he understood the past. Emily had not left because of one mistake or one evening that crossed a line. She had left because she had spent months realizing that the life they shared no longer contained space for her dreams, her work, or the person she had slowly become. The night he spent away had simply confirmed what she already knew. Daniel placed the ring gently back onto the marble counter and stepped away, looking around the quiet room one last time as the final light of the day faded outside the window. For the first time since everything had unfolded, he stopped searching for signs that Emily might still return. The house no longer felt like a place holding its breath. It felt like a place that had quietly accepted the truth before he did. And standing there in the calm silence of the kitchen, Daniel finally understood something that arrived far too late to change anything. Emily had not left to punish him. She had left because she had finally remembered how to choose herself. The night had fully settled over Maple Street by the time Daniel Carter turned off the last light in the living room and stood alone in the quiet kitchen once more. Outside, the neighborhood had grown calm, porch lights glowing softly along the sidewalks while the distant sound of a passing car faded into the dark Chicago evening. Inside the house, the silence felt different now, no longer sharp or confusing, but steady and complete, like the final page of a chapter that had already been written. Daniel rested his hands on the marble counter and looked one last time at the gold ring lying beside the folded note. 24 hours earlier, that small object had felt like a question he needed answered. Now it looked like something simpler, a reminder of a promise that had quietly reached its end. He picked up the ring and held it between his fingers, the cool metal reflecting the faint kitchen light, while memories passed slowly through his mind. He remembered the day he first met Emily at a small gallery opening near Lake Michigan. The way she had spoken about design and art with a calm excitement that made every idea sound possible. He remembered the early years of their marriage when weekends felt unhurried and the future seemed wide open. At the time, he believed those moments would naturally continue forever, the way a calm lake seems permanent when you are standing beside it. But now he understood something he had never considered before. The lake only appears still from a distance. Beneath the surface, the water is always moving forward. Emily had been moving forward all along. Daniel set the ring back onto the counter and looked around the quiet kitchen one final time. The room felt almost unfamiliar now, stripped of the small details that once gave it warmth. Yet beneath that emptiness, there was a strange clarity that had taken an entire day to reach him. Emily had not walked away in anger or bitterness. She had simply reached the point where staying no longer matched the life she wanted to build. And instead of asking permission, instead of waiting for someone else to notice, she had quietly stepped into that life on her own. Daniel walked toward the front door and opened it, letting the cool night air drift into the hallway. The maple trees along the street moved gently in the evening breeze, their leaves whispering softly above the sidewalk. For a moment he stood there looking out at the calm neighborhood, the same place that had always felt like the center of his world. But tonight it felt different. Not broken, not ruined, just changed in a way that could not be reversed. Daniel closed the door again and turned back toward the quiet house, understanding at last what the note on the counter had meant. Emily had not left because she was lost. She had left because she had finally found the direction she wanted to follow. And the truth that lingered in the silent rooms behind him was simple and impossible to undo. By the time he began to understand her choice, she had already been gone long enough to know she would never need to come back.